The crystal chandelier above Maria's head cost more than her entire village back in Honduras could earn in a decade. She knew this because Mr. Thornton had mentioned it during one of his lavish dinner parties, laughing as his guests sipped champagne that sparkled like liquid diamonds. Maria had stood in the corner that night, invisible in her gray uniform, refilling glasses and clearing plates while her hands trembled from exhaustion. She had been working as a maid in his Manhattan penthouse for 3 months, sending every spare dollar back home to her dying mother. But tonight was different. Tonight, Mr. Thornton had made her an offer that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. It started when Maria was dusting the mahogany shelves in his private study. Mr. Thornton burst through the door, his phone pressed against his ear, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from losing something valuable. He was a self-made millionaire, the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor and treated everyone around him as either an asset or an obstacle. Maria had learned to make herself small in his presence, to move like a shadow and speak only when spoken to. But as he paced back and forth, switching between English and rapid-fire Mandarin Chinese, she couldn't help but notice the desperation creeping into his voice. He slammed the phone down on his desk and ran his fingers through his silver-streaked hair. On the computer screen in front of him was a document covered in complex Chinese characters, the kind that seemed to dance and shimmer with importance. Maria continued dusting, her movements careful and deliberate, but her eyes kept drifting to the screen. She had always been good with languages, picking up fragments of Mandarin from the Chinese restaurant where she worked nights, learning Portuguese from her neighbors, teaching herself English through library books and television shows. Languages were her escape, her secret garden in a life filled with scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Mr. Thornton noticed her lingering near the desk and barked at her to leave, but then something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her eyes had focused on the screen with unexpected intensity, or maybe it was simply the cruel amusement of a man who had run out of options. He leaned back in his leather chair and studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who had built an empire on reading people. Maria felt her skin prickle under his scrutiny. She had learned to endure many things in this job, the condescension, the casual dismissals, the way Mr. Thornton sometimes forgot her name even though she cleaned his home 6 days a week. But this look was different. This was the look of a man about to make a wager. "You speak Spanish, correct?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Maria nodded, clutching her dust cloth like a lifeline. "And probably some broken English you picked up from television." He smirked, and Maria felt the familiar sting of being underestimated. She had a college degree from back home, had been studying to become a teacher before her father's death left her family drowning in debt. But here, in this gleaming tower of wealth, her education meant nothing. She was just another immigrant, another invisible worker in a city full of them. Mr. Thornton gestured dramatically at the computer screen. "This document, it's a contract for a deal that could make me another $10 million. The problem is, my translator just quit, the deal closes tomorrow morning, and every professional service I've called is either booked or charging fees that would make a lawyer blush." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like bait. "The document is in traditional Chinese. Complex legal terminology, technical jargon, the works. I need it translated perfectly by 6 a.m. tomorrow." Maria's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned that showing emotion in front of Mr. Thornton was like showing weakness to a predator. He continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "So here's my offer, Maria. Translate this document for me, accurately and completely, and I'll give you my entire month's salary. $150,000. He laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the walls. "Of course, if you get even one clause wrong, if you mistranslate a single critical term, you're fired immediately. No severance, no reference, nothing." The room seemed to tilt around Maria. $150,000. That was enough to pay for her mother's surgery, to clear her family's debts, to finally breathe after years of drowning. But the document on the screen was intimidating, dense with characters she only partially recognized. Mr. Thornton was still laughing, clearly convinced he had made an impossible offer to an uneducated maid. To him, this was entertainment, a brief distraction from his business problems. He probably expected her to refuse, to shuffle away with her head down, confirming every stereotype he held about people like her. But Maria thought about her mother's last letter, about how the pain had gotten worse, about how the doctors said there was still time but not much. She thought about her younger sister who had dropped out of school to work in a factory, about her brother who was trying to feed his children on wages that barely covered rice and beans. She thought about every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every time someone had looked through her as if she didn't exist. And then she looked Mr. Thornton directly in the eyes, something she had never dared to do before, and said simply, "I'll do it." The surprise on his face was almost worth the risk. He had expected her to decline, to know her place. Instead, she stood there with her shoulders straight, her dustcloth still in hand, waiting for him to hand over the impossible task. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, maybe respect, maybe just renewed amusement at what he assumed would be her spectacular failure. He shrugged and gestured toward the computer. "The document is in the system. You have until 6 a.m. Don't bother me unless you're done or you're quitting." As he left the study, Maria approached the desk with trembling hands. She sat down in the leather chair that was still warm from his body and stared at the screen. The document was indeed intimidating, 27 pages of dense legal Chinese covering manufacturing agreements, intellectual property rights, liability clauses, and technical specifications for electronic components. Her Mandarin was far from perfect, cobbled together from restaurant conversations, online courses she took on her phone during subway rides, and a worn Chinese-English dictionary she had bought from a street vendor. But she had something Mr. Thornton didn't know about, something she had kept hidden like a precious secret. She had been teaching herself Chinese for 3 years, not because she needed it for her jobs, but because learning had always been her way of holding on to hope, of reminding herself that she was more than the circumstances life had dealt her. Maria began to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she cross-referenced terms, checked meanings, verified contexts. The study grew dark around her as night deepened into the small hours of morning. She made herself coffee in the kitchen, her hands shaking from exhaustion and nerves, then returned to the glowing screen. Some phrases came easily, others required her to dig through online dictionaries and legal databases, piecing together meanings like a detective solving a mystery. She thought about giving up a dozen times, thought about walking away and protecting herself from the humiliation of failure. But each time she felt her courage wavering, she pictured her mother's face, and she kept going. The hardest parts were the technical specifications and the liability clauses, where a single mistranslated word could change the entire meaning of a sentence. Maria found herself drawing on every resource she could access, comparing similar documents online, checking and rechecking her work until her eyes burned and her back ached from sitting. Somewhere around 4 a.m., she finished the first draft and then began the painstaking process of reviewing everything again. She knew that Mr. Thornton hadn't expected her to succeed, that he was probably sleeping peacefully in his bedroom, already planning how he would mock her failure over breakfast. But Maria had learned something in her years of surviving in a country that often treated her as less than human. She had learned that being underestimated was a kind of power, that people's low expectations could become your secret weapon. Every time someone had assumed she was stupid because of her accent, every time a customer had spoken slowly and loudly as if volume could bridge the gap of understanding, she had simply smiled and absorbed another lesson about how the world worked. And now, in this moment, she was going to prove that their assumptions had been wrong all along. As dawn began to paint the sky outside the study windows, Maria completed her final review. The translation was as accurate as she could make it, every term carefully chosen, every nuance preserved. She had even added footnotes where certain phrases had multiple possible interpretations, showing the options and explaining why she had chosen each translation. It was work that would have impressed a professional translator, but Maria didn't know that. She only knew that she had given everything she had, that she had poured 3 years of secret study and a lifetime of determination into these pages. She hit the print button and watched as the document emerged from the printer, 27 pages that represented either her salvation or her destruction. At exactly 6 a.m., Maria knocked on Mr. Thornton's bedroom door. She heard him grunt and shuffle, clearly annoyed at being awakened. When he opened the door, his hair disheveled and his silk pajamas wrinkled, he looked at her with bleary confusion. "What?" he snapped, and then his eyes focused on the document in her hands. The confusion transformed into disbelief, then into something harder to read. He snatched the papers from her, certain that she had simply printed out gibberish or given up halfway through. But as he flipped through the pages, his expression began to change.